Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and today I'm going to tell you 10 tips to make great queens. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 10 tips that help you with grafting queens. Some of them can be applied to just making walkaway splits or other ways to make queens, but this is mostly directed towards grafting queens. So you want to check your grafts after 24 hours. The reason why I say this is if you're new to grafting, you may not get a very good take your first try. And if you check 24 hours after, you'll be able to see which cells the bee started. And then if you don't like however many they took or they didn't take any, then bam, you can just graft again. And then you'll have as many cells probably that second time. And you could even do it a third time if you wanted to. You'd have to make sure you pull those cells out at different times because they were grafted on different days. But it's an easy trick and absolutely worth it to check your take after 12 or 24 hours. To make sure that you got enough queens, as many as you want. Tip number 2, when you're grafting, make sure that you have like a hot towel or a towel that you put like very warm tap water on, and then you squeeze it out. So it's just like a little bit damp, but also very warm. Once you graft your queens, what you can do is carefully wrap the towel around the bar, and that keeps the humidity really high around for the larva, because while the temperature is important for the larva, you really need to have the heat or the humidity right. Like it's more important that the larvae stay really humid than it is that they stay warm. Warm's good too, so you can, if you're grafting in your car, let's say, make sure that you have the heat on for a little while before you start grafting, but mainly make sure that it's humid enough. That's really important to keep those grafts alive before you put them in your cell builder colony. Tip number 3, brush the bees off the frame, do not shake them. So when you're going through your hive and you found the perfect frame of larvae, they're just the tiniest little things, you can barely even see them, but they're in pools of royal jelly. You find that frame, and when you're taking it out, you're gonna take it with you and you're gonna graft. So you wanna have to get the bees off the frame. And so most people will just shake the bees off the frame, and whilst this is fine, it's one small detail that can potentially help you have a better grafting percentage, and I think it's just easier on the larva. So what you can do is take your bee brush or like maybe an old goldenrod stem or something, and you just brush the bees off the frame. And brushing them off the frame makes it so the larva is not jarred. And it may not matter if you're making a split or something and you're shaking a frame of larva, it's not going to kill the larva. But it's ideal to have those larvae not damaged even a tiny bit. So brush the bees off the frames when you're finding your graft frame. Tip 4, add the larva to the queenless portion of your cell builder. So when you're starting out and you've made up your cell builder, you want to leave it queenless for a certain amount of time, like at least a day, maybe 2 or 3 days. And in that time, you might be tempted to not put any larvae in there because you won't want any larvae in there when you add your grafts in. But it's important that you put a frame of larvae in there whilst you don't have any grafts in there. What this does is the nurse bees still have their, I'm gonna mess up the name, hypopharyngeal glands activated because they're feeding the larvae on that frame that you gave them in your queenless starter. So since you've let the bees have a frame of larvae in there to feed, the nurse bees' glands are still activated. So when you do put in your grafts and you take out their frame of larvae that you gave them, then they're all primed and ready to go to make tons of royal jelly to make the best queens possible. So make sure that you're leaving are the bees still gonna make cells? Could they be great cells? Absolutely. But this is just one more fine detail that you can tune to having great success when grafting and making great queens. Because as Cameron Reynolds says, great queens, dead mites, and good nutrition. Those are the 3 things you need. So tip 5, add a queen excluder to your hive that you're gonna use for cell building 10 days before you wanna graft. And the reason I say this is, let's say, well, this is for a specific method, but a lot of people use a method where, myself included, where you have a double deep hive that you're going to make queens from. 10 days before you want to graft, you put a queen excluder on. And that way the queen is relegated to laying in only one of the box. In the box that she's not able to lay in, the bees will start getting older. So by the time that you're ready to graft, there won't be any larvae for the hive to make any queens from. There'll be 0 larvae because after 10 days they're capped. So if you put it on 10 days before the graft, then by the time that you want to graft, there'll be no larva in one box, and you want to take that box to start off the cells and then put it back on and use the whole hive as a finisher. So make sure that you add your queen excluder 10 days before. Can you do it without doing that? Absolutely. But simplifies everything. You're much less likely to get a rogue queen cell. And since the bees are making the queen cell, it's probably an older larva. And if you get that older larva and they make a queen cell, then it's going to hatch before your cells probably. And then that queen's going to hatch, kill every single one of your cells. Boom, you just wasted all your time and effort. So if you put a queen excluder on 10 days before, this ensures that there's no larva possible for them to make a queen. So I highly suggest doing this. It's made my life a lot easier. I've had many close calls with virgin queens almost emerging and killing my cells. So tip 6, put a pollen frame directly against the graft frame. This might be the most important thing that I tell you in this entire video. If you take anything out, it's this. Pollen is extremely important for bees' nutrition. And since a queen only has about 4 days to get all the food into her to develop, I can't remember the word, but to develop that 8 days where she doesn't get any food, she needs an incredible amount of nutrition in those 4 days that she's a larva to become a great queen. So the fats proteins and fats in the pollen are so incredibly important to making great queens. So you want to have a full frame of pollen, both sides, directly next to your graft frame. Don't just put it in the box. Make sure you're putting it right next to whatever frame, where your graft frame is. It's so important. It'll help you make great queens, and really focus on that one detail, especially. Tip 7, add tons of nurse bees. So what makes great queens is swarming environments, when there's tons, unlimited food and unlimited bees to make great queen cells. We're able to harness the same idea when grafting, because what do? We add tons of food in that frame of pollen and some nectar, and then also we're adding tons of really young bees, the nurse bees. So you could go through your 5 other hives and shake in nurse bees. So the nurse bees are going to be on the frames of larvae, and so make sure you go into your other hives and shake some nurse bees in, because you want that starter to be absolutely packed out full of bees. And another trick, I would still suggest you shake bees, but if you add frames of capped brood before, 10 to 14 days before you want to graft, that hive's going to have a lot more nurse bees when it's time to do your grafting. So this year my goal is 10 to 14 days before I graft, 10 to 14 days before I graft, I'm going to make sure that the top box of whatever hive that I'm grafting into is going to have like 8 frames of capped brood. I'm just going to pull all the young brood out of that box, drop in all capped brood. And that way, when the hive is ready to make queens, they will have had all of those bees hatch, because if it's capped brood, 10 days later it'll hatch. And then they don't become nurse bees on day 1 of their life. So if I give 3 or 4 days for them to mature enough, even the latest capped brood will be nurse bees by the time that I want to graft. So 10 days for it to hatch, and I think 3 or 4 days it'll start to become a nurse bee. So that's how you get the best queens, is by having tons of nurse bees, by adding capped brood and shaking in nurse bees from other hives, which are on frames of larvae. Tip 8, make sure there's existing honey or nectar in your starter and your finisher. Tip 9, use a deep frame isolator or a timing box. So a timing box is a box where you have the queen separated. So you're making sure that she's only on one frame, and that's an empty frame. Because if you put her in said empty frame, I think 4 days before you graft, 4 days before you want to graft, then this makes it she'll lay a bunch of eggs on that frame, maybe 5 or 6 days. And by the time that you're ready to graft 4 days later, then there'll be a bunch of larvae that you know the exact age of. you know that they are the youngest larva possible that you can graft, and therefore they will make the best queens because they'll have the longest time to get nutrition from your cell builder and your starter and finisher. So Bob Binney has videos about timing boxes. I'll leave them in the description. But you add them, what he does is he just cuts 2 slits in the side of the box, and he drops pieces of queen excluders in them. And then he puts the queen on that one empty frame in between the excluders. The bees are able to pass through it, but she's not able to leave that one frame. So he gets her to lay on that one frame. And the way I'm doing it, because I don't want to do a timing box, it's called a deep frame isolator. It's from Better Bee. I think it was at like $30. You find the queen, you put her on whatever frame that's empty that you want to have her lay into. You set the deep frame isolator into the hive. And then once you've done that, you set the frame in there with the queen on it, and then the bees are able to pass through and take care of the brood, but she's stuck laying on that one frame, so you know the exact age of the larva. So my 10th and final tip, probably my first or second most important one that I've given, is make sure you're feeding while you're making the cells. Even if they have infinite amounts of food in the hive and a good amount coming in, you still want to feed. Make sure that you have pollen patties on there, because pollen is so important for the queen's development and the production of royal jelly, which is the nutrition the queens need to develop properly. And then also, I really think you should feed syrup, even if you're in a flow. For whatever reason, I seem to get a lot more queens, even from when the hives are being fed, than when they're just on a honey flow. I think that might be a coincidence, but for whatever reason, I don't want to take that risk. So every time that I'm making a queen cell starter and when it's a finisher, I'm going to make absolutely sure that I'm feeding it. So I'm going to make sure it has pollen patty, and I'm going to feed it, I think, really light syrup. So I might do two parts water to 1 part sugar, or something like that. A very light syrup, at least 1 to 1. And that's very stimulative. So it'll help them draw more wax on the queen cells, and it's just a big deal to be able to do that. So as you can probably tell from this video, I'm very passionate about queen rearing. I've had some success in these past couple of years. I've sold over 30 queens, and I've made probably close to 100. So I've learned a lot, and all these little tips and tricks, I think that they're important to being successful when grafting. You don't need to do every one of these, but it makes a big difference if you do all of them, I think. If you're interested in more videos about feeding bees, it's one of the most important things in beekeeping to understand what it does to the bees and when it can be used. I'll link the video right up here.